Sheila, do you want to kick it off on introductions?
Yes, absolutely. I'm excited to have this heavy hitter panel here. And so we'll just go from my right and starting out with Dr. Michael Connor. And Dr. Michael Connor, if you just give us a brief description of who you are and what you're about, and we'll move on.
Yes, hi, good afternoon, everybody. Dr. Mike Connor, CEO and founder of the Agile Evolutionary Group. I had just about every position in the education ecosystem, ranging from teacher all the way up to superintendent. Now do a lot of domestic and international work around education transformation, education company, or I should say, companies, transformation, education firms, and also I am an author. My book, Intentional, Bold, and Unapologetic, A Guide to Transforming Schools in the AC Stage of Education, came out last year, and have a national and international podcast called Voices for Excellence. So all over the ecosystem. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the invite, Bryce and Pixel Health team, and good to see you, Dr. Debose.
And we will start with Bryce Baker, or next with Bryce Baker.
I'm Bryce, everybody, the co-founder of Pixel Health, and we create programs for kids to protect them against the negative effects of social media. We work with a lot of organizations you might be familiar with, like Major League Baseball, and with schools all across the country. And we're powered by a great group of scientists, educators, researchers, psychologists that help us find the most up-to-date information on digital wellness to make sure that kids can learn gold standard practices. And we also have software that helps us track their changes, so we can see in real time how kids are learning these different behaviors and how they're able to socialize better behaviors in their communities.
For that, and moving on to the lovely Dr. Dawn Debose.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Dawn Debose, and I'm the Chief of Schools in Stafford Municipal School District. And Stafford is outside of Houston. I actually worked in Houston ISD for many years before coming to Stafford. And some of my responsibilities include working with all of the schools. I also work with our counselors. I work with our nurses. So it's very much a part of when we think about wellness and mental health. That's part of what I do on a daily basis. In addition to the fact I'm a traditionally trained educator, I have been everything from a teacher, counselor, principal, and then obviously a central office. So I definitely have a keen interest based on my background as it relates to mental health and all the things, all the challenges that our students have on a daily basis.
And we are working with Dr. Brown to get him to be present because his voice is also very important. But as Bryce said, we're going to be very aware and respectful of time. So we're going to get started with this. I'm going to say something that people may not even know they need, right? And really to be hygienic about social media and how our students and how we're going to protect them. So we're going to just jump right in. And the first overview question, if you will, if we'll start with you, Bryce, to give us some framework for what we're going to be talking about and how it is important for us to be aware and create this table that we are preparing for people to sit.
Absolutely. So I think it'd be helpful. I'll just pull up a couple guiding slides just to help everybody understand sort of where we are now. And I just want to make sure, is that visible to everybody? Yep. Yes. Okay, perfect. So, obviously here, there are comparables from our past history. It took us a long time to figure out that smoking causes lung cancer. And obviously we want to get more ahead of issues before it leads to premature issues in the public health of our country. And when you look at the early data from social media, it's pretty alarming and shocking. So you can see, obviously, it's ubiquitous amongst kids. 95% of kids over the age of 13 use social media, and more than a third of those are using it almost constantly, from their words. And unfortunately, when you look at the past decade of health trends, whether it's depression, anxiety, sleep disorders, all of those have been on the rise pretty much in lockstep with the use of social media and proliferation of accounts. And you can see here in this graph on the right that increased social media use and depression are linked. So, the more you use, the more likely you are to experience clinical depression and symptoms. And unfortunately, it doesn't stop there. So if you look at this list of mental, physical, behavioral, or neurodevelopmental disorders, social media is linked in some way, shape, or form to all of these. So an increase in social media use and problematic social media use will lead to worse academic performance, more cyberbullying, and even Tourette's in some strong cases. When you look at also the trends from our scores, when we've been speaking to educators quite a bit this year, and they've noticed a decrease in focus, a decrease in the ability to do homework all at once, or even to turn in the work at all. And then when you look at the national trends, unfortunately, they support those claims. So starting in around 2010, 2011, when we started to see the proliferation of smartphones and social media use, the scores of math and reading started to slow decline, and then were accelerated during the COVID period. Additionally, this extends to working memory and fluid intelligence. So the studies are showing now that the closer your phone is to you, essentially what this graph shows you is that the closer your phone is to you, the less ability you have to focus, and the less ability you have to remember, and the less ability you have to answer simple tasks. And so if it's on your desk, it's closest to you versus in your bag, it's not quite as bad. If it's in the other room, all of a sudden you're a superhuman again. And so these are kind of the, the simple things that don't seem simple in the moment. When you look at the numbers and they're shocking enough, it can help us make change. The last piece I think that's important to touch on as sort of this overview is you have a generation of kids where they're getting their news daily from social media feeds, and all the current studies show that it's very difficult to assess information credibly. And I don't know if any of you have seen recently, but there's a lot of young Americans that are even supporting Osama bin Laden on TikTok because of the information cycle that they're in, and because of the, I guess you'd call it, silo that social media puts you into, and how these platforms are, and I'm sure we'll touch on this later, kind of incentivized to algorithmically radicalize you, to push you more radical content over time, and to sort of place kids in these niche content holes. So I'll pause there for a second.
I'm always shocked by how social media negatively impacts our students. And so this brings me to Dr. Connor, if you would discuss the lack of boundaries in the digital space and how schools become crucial in mitigating these challenges.
Yeah, thank you. And Bryce, I think the data that you presented, very profound and compelling. I was actually writing some of those metrics down, specifically when you say 95%, right? That is extreme. And when we think about the mitigation strategies and boundaries that need to be implemented, I just kind of want to go back. The students that we're educating today, right, in the AC stage of education after COVID-19 is dominated by Generation Alpha and Generation Z. When we think about the core attributes of Generation Alpha and Generation Z, what were they born in, right? They were born with an iPod or an iPad or an iPhone in their hand. They're I like to say, the original digital natives. So when we think about who's coming into our schools, the ramification and the impact by the pandemic, these compounding variables, Bryce touched upon it around the academic disparities, literacy and numeracy, and then now we're dealing with mental health, right? This is what our superintendents and our districts are dealing with. And then you add in this component of social media. Now you got this consequence of quandaries that we have to be able to mitigate without any guideposts or standard policies. I don't see how we can establish or develop standard policies when the sophistication of the algorithms, the artificial intelligence, the generative intelligence is becoming even more smart, is becoming more sophisticated. So I think that we have to be able to not only develop focus groups to continue having this discussion on how you mitigate this critical issue or this quandary around social media health, but also the lasting impact that it will have on our students. That has to be integrated into the conversation. But more importantly, we have to look at innovative ways to be able to stop social media utilization in this excessive form where now, Bryce, you talked about it, sleep, when you talk about depression, sleep disorder, trauma. We're seeing an increase, and Dr. Brown and Dr. Debose can speak about it more, an increase of physical altercations, tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3 leveled infractions that are caused by social media. So I think that, we need to find out what those guidelines are, have those guidelines be adaptable and flexible, try to identify what would be some standard policies around this, but make this more where we have to look at urgency, that this is a national crisis that we're facing.
And Bryce, if you'll chime in for me or for us, if you will, the specific aspects of how our health challenges, you talked about it, but what type of network or what type of addictive design can we be? It's almost too late to say proactive, but what do we do now?
It's a great question. I think the first thing to recognize is that unfortunately, we're sort of at odds. And when I say we, I mean educators, parents, kids, at odds with the goals of the companies themselves. So the goals of the company are to keep you online as long as possible and by any means necessary. And we're on the other side of that equation. And I'm sure a lot of people probably heard this in the news that, there's a lot of things that social media companies can do to keep you online, such as feeding you more and more radical content, which leads to some of the things I mentioned briefly earlier. I think when it's what can we do, the first step is just educating people that this is the lay of the land. And that makes a big difference because when you speak to kids, and we've had a lot of focus groups with kids, they really don't like being on the we're being used side. And, even social media companies themselves call people users. They call everyone that's using their product a user. Kids don't like being used. And so when you start to explain that to them, and this is the lay of the land, even that is a first step, gets kids thinking about, okay, what role should I be playing in the landscape? And we've already seen it be really effective in terms of socializing new behaviors amongst communities and saying, here's the lay of the land. What are your thoughts on that? Do you like the idea that everything you say on here is being recorded? Do you like the idea that what you say is recorded and then also that feeds into the content that they show you to keep you online longer because that benefits them? So even starting to go through that process with kids, I think you'd be surprised at how much kids are receptive to those types of lessons.
I want to switch gears and hear from you, Dr. Debose and Dr. Brown, on the academic aspect of learning challenges. If you would discuss the lack of boundaries, Dr. Debose, in the digital space and how schools become, again, not only the crucial mitigator, but from your point of view, the impact that has on parents, students, and even the personnel that you are over.
Okay, so certainly we know that there has been an increase as it relates, because I'm going to take it in the direction more of like cyberbullying, and so we know that there have been more incidents in that particular realm for our students, and so with that, we know that has to be coupled with we're making sure that our parents are aware of some of the tools, because of course we know the kids are ahead of us as it relates to the tools that are out there. And so, when you have families that are they're just trying to focus on surviving, they want their kids to have phones because they want them to have access. We all know the type of climate that we're in. So we know we have all of those variables to deal with, but again, it is a problem, in terms of, and we don't want to see kids have to receive consequences or go to our alternative programs, because they don't have the understanding. And in some cases, they do have the understanding, but we do know that it is something that we find ourselves addressing, and know that we have to continually find ways to educate our parents so that they can be aware as to what they can do and what's available to them to be able to watch and observe and put those tools in place to help with their kids.
And Dr. Brown, if you would chime in on that and delve in a little,
Sure.
expand on it,
Sorry to
however
join.
you see. Glad to have you.
Sorry to
How are
join.
you?
I'm doing well, thank you. I think it's important that we're in a position where we have to reestablish norms in school. There was a time, of course, when most of us were in school when there was an emergency. the front office would call the authorities and the responders would come in and respond. Now we're in a space where if anything happens at school, not only does that call go out, but the kids are also calling their parents, who then call the authorities as well. And so what we've heard from our first responders is they get a plethora of calls about one incident. They'd rather get one call so they can respond more efficiently. Something we put in place here is we have put a prohibition on use of cell phones in our secondary schools, our middle schools and high schools. And because of that, we now have seen a 20% decrease in disruptive behaviors in classrooms. Kids are reporting that they're more attentive to what's happening in class. They're having more socially productive time when they're not in class, and they're in hallways and things of that nature. So I think it's a matter of just resetting norms and getting people to understand that those emergencies, that they don't need 300 calls to the police department when something happens at a school.
And if you would, my apologies, but if you would introduce yourself for the audience and the masses and your role and
Sure.
why you are so pivotal in this conversation.
Sure, I'm Melvin Brown, I'm superintendent in Montgomery Public Schools in Montgomery, Alabama. We have had, and this is my second year as superintendent, we've combated numbers of different things that have been classroom disruptions that have prevented kids from learning, and we knew that cell phones played a pretty big role in that. So our principals actually approached us about, hey, what can we do? Here's an idea we might want to throw out. And my principals brought this idea to us to entertain, to bring about that prohibition with cell phones. So now our students still retain their phones all day long. They're just locked in lockable pouches that they carry with them all day, that they can only open at a few access points throughout the building, and they need permission to do so. So now those phones, although they're still on their person, they can't disrupt what happens on a daily basis at school. And as a result, those types of incidents, we've had a huge decrease in those.
But Sheila, I would like to add,
Sure.
in terms of schools, I think we're getting to the point that we know how to stop it at school. We're getting, I think, closer to that. And obviously in Montgomery, they have found a way to do that. So a lot of that is a matter of, again, how can we help our families at home? Because we know that sometimes these issues are happening. We know that they can happen typically during transitions at school, but a lot of times we are having to deal with discipline issues around cyberbullying or social media outside of school hours. And obviously it flows into the school and is disruptive.
Yes, I appreciate that. And if in the chat, if you'd like to add, specific questions around the conversations, please feel free to do that. And Dr. Connor, if you would also chime in the conversation around what it looks like for solutions, be it at the school, home, or what are your thoughts based on your work with educators on how this excessive social media also impacts academic performance?
Yeah, and I think the strategies that Dr. Brown and Dr. Debose provided are exceptional, and to be able to couple that, obviously, I think that we have to find new ways to integrate this into teacher practices, right? Find new ways so that it become a part of, I like to say, the operating model or the systems of instruction for districts as well as leaders. Curriculum, right? Core curriculum around that, because this brings so much of, I like to say, ambiguous thought on how to be able to tackle this, to address this. What is a streamlined approach, followed by what are approaches that teachers can employ? So I think that we have to, build social capital, and then also we have to build individual human capital with our students as well. Partnerships with parents as well as with our families. That's going to be critical. The synergy with the application of strategies that are replicated home, school, and home is important as well. But I think that one that we have to be able to address this is to create a common language around what are the best practices and the strategies so that we can provide that nexus type of support in our schools.
And Dr. Brown, you talked about how your principals came to you. Could you expand a little bit more on how leaders are able to work this effectively and cohesively?
Sure. They were begging for some type of remedy to the types of cell phone disruptions we've had at school. So numbers of things would happen. For example, they might be planning fights within the school day. So they would text whomever and say, we're going to meet at such and such, and this is where it's going to happen. Or they would plan out-of-school activities, or social media distractions in school would come in, would follow us in the classroom. Issues that happened in the neighborhood previous night will come back to school via the cell phone. So they were begging for some type of solution that helped them govern how to utilize their classroom spaces more effectively and keep kids on task. The only way to do that was really to find a way to get phones out of the hands of kids without having teachers to have to police all that all day long. So this us via our principals, and we get through with our constituents to get some input, and we had some concerns. Some parents were having the same types of issues we just discussed in reference to emergencies, and we had to explain to them that the first responders don't enter calls. And I think they understood and respected that. And so now our teachers are able to focus on instruction as opposed to chasing down cell phones all day long. And our principals have indicated very few violations of the cell phone policy. Now, you don't get 100% of anything, so they've had a few to deal with, but far fewer than they would have otherwise.
Transitioning to in case of emergency, if you would, Dr. Debose, how can we encourage hygienic cell phone usage while continuing to maintain the safety for those parents and students?
Well, interesting enough, one of the things that we had to do at the beginning of the school year, because it was a tremendous issue at one of our middle schools. And so I don't know if you all are familiar with CHAMPS. CHAMPS is like a behavioral management system. And so with that, we had to come up with very specific ways in which you could engage with your phone, because the thing about it is, and I know Dr. Connor can speak to this based on his work, we know that the cell phone is an educational tool also. So how do you balance that? So we literally had to come up with management systems, because there are times in which it is appropriate to use your phone. So we actually did some training around that system, which is CHAMPS. That it's a nationwide program that many people are familiar with, but we had to incorporate that to say how we're going to use phones and when it's allowable. So that's one of the things that we've actually done in our district to try to, again, curve the negative aspect of it, but still, okay, how can we use the phone in a positive manner?
And if you would, Dr. Brown, let's talk about how Dr. Debose kind of set us up for this, reestablishing the norms of how cell phones are used. Going back, I'm going to date myself, but having to go to the front office to call your parents, those kinds of things, if you would, for us.
Yeah, I agree completely with Dr. Debose. The phone could be a tool for education and learning as well. We had to make a sacrifice, and we said that because kids were now in a situation where everyone had a device, because we're a one-to-one district, we didn't necessarily have the utility in the classroom to use them, so we had to make that sacrifice. So now when there's a situation that takes place at home or at school, let's say a parent wants to reach a kid for whatever reason, they do what my mom did when I was in school and simply call the front office and dismiss the kid to come in and call. Or if there was an emergency at school, let's say a student had some type of emergency after school that was going to take place after school and had to contact parents to say whatever that might be, give them a pass, let them go to the office and utilize the phone. So I think it's made it a little less convenient, if you will, for those phone calls to be made. But I also think the numbers of true emergencies we might have aren't genuinely always emergency. I think now when there is an actual emergency, people respond appropriately to it, as opposed to, Mom, I forgot my pencil, I'm calling you to bring me one. That's not an emergency.
Right. And Dr. Brown, someone in the chat asked, how are parents responding to these new norms and rules?
They've been pretty good. I mean, early on, of course, they didn't fully understand all of it, so there was a little bit of pushback initially because they wanted to be able to reach their kids for whatever reason. But once we started to talk about the academic benefits of not having that type of access to your kid all day long, he's in school. He's supposed to be attending to work. That's what his quote job might. Let him do his job while you're doing yours. And if there's a true emergency that truly you need to reach your child, let us know. You have to go get it and let that conversation take place. And, as we've gone through the year, the only hiccup we might have is when kids do violate the cell phone policy somehow by sneaking in a phone or putting a fake phone in their pouch or whatever the case may be. we'll call parents, we'll retain that phone for 24 hours until they pick it up. And I think parents have realized that, okay, now my child, you're inconveniencing me. You need to follow this policy so I'm not pulled out of work simply to come get your phone.
And if you would elaborate on that or your thoughts, Dr. Connor.
Yeah, no, I think Dr. Debose bring up a strong point, right? And it goes back to capacity building of how we can be able to ensure that students are utilizing or the utility of, let's say, a cell phone is for educational purposes. We know with the takeoff with artificial intelligence, generative intelligence, that can be a true lever or a true instructional tool that can provide that level of personalization and differentiation that neither any of us on this call can do because of the advancement of artificial intelligence. Albeit I want to stress this, is that we still have to be able to renorm what the utilization look like, right? Because we see the actual detriments that it brings, the correlations between academic outcomes and achievement and the impact that it can have on our students, both from a mental and physical standpoint. So again, it kind of goes back to that overarching, I like to say, mega theme around building capacity, building social capital as well as human capital with regards in our students, and having that reciprocal relationship with school, district, and home families to ensure that there's that level of reciprocity so that how we can be able to utilize the cell phone as a tool, not as a detriment.
However, I would like to say this. It has been helpful because our district is also a one-to-one device district. So it has alleviated us having to, in terms of students keeping cell phones, because we have iPads. So the iPads do help where we can say, hey, here's, we're still able to accomplish what we need with our devices where we can eliminate the cell phone. So that is becoming actually less and less of an issue with the cell phones because we do have the iPads.
Yeah. And those are the guideposts, Felicia, that Dr. Brown and Dr. Debose are putting in. And I think districts need to be more strict with how they're putting those guideposts, reinforcing them, and then also what's that level of shared accountability when those guideposts and those guardrails are in place.
And I appreciate this because this leads us to the stakeholders and the community. And I appreciate Pixel Health for allowing this conversation to start. And we know that it's not going to end or be resolved now, but my next question is to Dr. Debose. How does social media impact the diverse communities within your district? And are there any unique challenges based on those social economic variables?
So definitely, we know that at this point, it affects all kids. You have some families that may have multiple devices. They might have, a couple of laptops. They might have a desktop. Every kid in the family has, a cell phone. Whereas, another family with less means, there's at least one person or two people in the family that's going to have access to a mobile phone or have access to social media. So I would say you may have families that may not have as much, but they still have something. I don't know if I have met any family anytime recently that did not have at least one cell phone for that family. So with that, there's still ways, even with the kid with fewer devices, that can get the information. Obviously, the more you have, the more access. So, but I would say that equally, that is touching all aspects of our society, no matter whether you have just a few devices or multiple.
Absolutely. And we, in our work so far with schools, we found that the lower socioeconomic status communities have been affected more by this, really because of the lack of access to other activities and opportunities that are substituted for phones and for social media. And so if a child is sitting in their room on their phone for another 5 hours, opposed to going to an after school program or going to play sports or whatever kids used to do that have changed all these levels, that just makes the need more for those types of communities because of the substitute that happens naturally. And so, our feeling is it's more important in these communities that we educate kids, parents, educators on the negative effects and what they can do instead.
Yes, and so economically, how has that impacted your communities, Dr. Brown?
I think it's so our kids still get this. So what happens when they come to school each day? The way this looks is they come into the building, pouch their phones. They don't have them all day, and as they exit the building, then they can unpouch their phones. So access after school has not been an issue. And if there's a true emergency where you really, really need your phone, you simply go to an administrator and say, I really need to use this for X reason, and they can pop the pouch open and they can have access to it. So it hasn't really resulted in any inequities or lack of access to transportation or after-school care or what have you. So we haven't had those types of impediments thus far. I'm actually quite surprised that here we are in January and we have not had any specific, significant general feedback or negative feedback in regard to that implementation.
And so if you would, Bryce, capitalize on that a little bit more as far as what has Pixel Health seen as an assessment, or how has the numbers shown up for us on this as far as the stakeholders?
Yeah, I think we have to think of this sort of like there's multiple stakeholders involved that have to be addressed to get to the bottom of a solution. So I think it's the schools, it's the parents, and it's the kids themselves. And I think each of these aspects, so in the schools, we heard some great solutions on getting rid of the distraction when it's right next to you, because that leads to much better learning outcomes. We know this through our research for sure. That 7 hours a day is really important because, as Dr. Brown said, this is their job, right? This is basically their 9 to 5, they have to be focused. But when they're home, that still leaves another 16 hours where kids are kind of free roam, have their phone. And unfortunately, what we've seen is a lot of in that 16 hours, kids will bring those issues that happen there into the classroom amongst each other, which may lead to fights, bickering, cyberbullying, and they're bringing in the sleep deprivation and the mood issues that are developed in those 16 hours. So I think in terms of the at-home approach, we feel like there has to be a bring-in of the parents and the kids themselves to buy in to this kind of new philosophy of balance. And that's, I think, what's really key. And what we're trying to do is how our kids' behavior impacted when we start to measure a new type of behavior. So if kids start to learn about the effects of social media, if kids start to learn about putting their phone away an hour before bed, these types of simple things that can make big differences in their levels of happiness and productivity, can we see an overall change in the community? So I think that's what we're seeing in terms of like a multi-stakeholder approach that can work.
And so you touched on it, but the importance of educating all of the shareholders and stakeholders, everyone that's involved, is important. But if you and Dr. Connor would really pull it together on quantifying the problem and change behavior so that there's a call to action, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, actually, you know what? I'll share a quick graphic here, which will help me discuss this a little bit. I think when you look at the KPIs that are important to a lot of schools, whether it's body image, self-esteem, cyberbullying, intrusion in schoolwork, it's important that we know how much social media kind of affects each of these KPIs, because that allows us to do targeted solutions across these different stakeholders. So for example, with sleep quality, we know that it's very correlated. If you use a lot of social media in a negative way, you're going to be less happy and you're going to sleep less well. So what are the 4 or 5 things that we can teach kids to specifically address that? It's about blue light. It's about getting into conflict right before bed. These are the types of things that we think are really key to talk to kids about in the classroom, so that when they go home in those 16 hours, they're actually doing the right things to kind of create a better whole child approach. And so it's important for us that we're getting this data. This is our own proprietary data that we get on a day-to-day basis to know exactly how kids are feeling and exactly what interventions are working and how much they're working. And then, overall, we can see, for example, and apologies, one of our head researchers is Italian, so it always comes back in Italian on the first draft. But this was one of our recent cohorts. We always see a decrease immediately in screen time because kids are like, hey, we should go out and play. It returns to a more normal level, but still way down from where it was initially. So those are the types of things we can see in the community if we start to talk to kids about these key concepts.
Dr. Connor?
Yeah, ditto, right? Bryce, that was a strong data visualization, right? And when I think about this from an economic standpoint, those influencing factors, they play a huge part in contributing to the increase or decrease of achievement. And that regression model doesn't lie. It speaks for itself. The strategies are there on how we can be able to mitigate this from a scientific way and an analytical way as well. So I just hope that, that we can be able to translate what that regression model is saying into foundational practices within our schools, and more importantly, at home. And that's why that home school partnership becomes that much more important, right? When we look at moving beyond whole child, whole school, we have to move to a whole community approach. But great data visualization, that speaks for itself.
And I'd just like to go around some final remarks or some compelling things that you have wanted to share or what it sparked for you. So if you would, Dr. Debose.
Well, I would say for me, I think this has come more so to the forefront. So we'll say AD, we'll say after COVID, or shall I say AC. This has been building for a while, right? And so and when we kind of got back to normal school, I think people really realized the effect that social media was having on our students. So I think that it's a really good time to really, as Dr. Brown said, look at how are we going to create norms. Certainly with that, we've had to write a lot of, policy. We've had to address these types of issues that negatively affect schools, like in our, codes of conduct, those types of things. So certainly I can just even say one of my takeaways from just being a panelist and listening to the data today is really helping our students recognize, okay, this is how this is affecting you. So because sometimes it just sounds like, hey, you're doing social media too much. So now it's time to say, well, this is how this is affecting you. It's affecting you. It's affecting your grades. It's affecting, we obviously know, like through body image and all of that. I mean, that's huge. So I think that this is a good basis to really open up that conversation and identify how it's hurting our students, so that maybe they can have a better understanding of, okay, let's change our behaviors around this.
Thank you. And Dr. Brown?
Yeah, I'll say ditto to all of that, and just add the whole notion of the fact that we're trying to build responsible citizens who understand their obligation to give back to the society and to the world. They have to understand they have to get out of themselves and relate more to what happens outside of them. I think getting them away from social media a little bit more, or getting them active in more productive social media activities, gives them a better opportunity to understand their responsibility to give back. Having an egocentric society, if you will, that only thinks about me, contributes to some of the issues that we confront. I think if we can get our kids to have much more empathy about how their fellow human being lives, works, acts, feels, what have you, I think we'll have a better society overall, and many of the issues that we have to confront, we can mitigate. Unfortunately, we see far too much insensitivity toward humanity or disrespect for humanity, in that many of our kids don't understand the dangerous and lasting implications of their actions. I've had a number of shootings here in the past couple of weeks, and we've lost some kids as a result of that. And I don't think that our kids who were involved in those situations understand the finality of that or care about the finality of that, and that scares me greatly. So I think if we can help to drive better positive usage in this space, I think we create better citizens of the world and thus make a better society for everyone.
And I know we focused on our children, which is, obviously very important to everyone listening and even on the panel, but it also triggered for me my balance of social media, my balance of digital hygiene, and how I personally need to do a little bit more pull away and walk away and be more active outside as well. So as we are educating our students, we don't need to tell them do as I say, not as I do, right? So it's challenged me to also move a little bit more and not be so tied to my screen as well. And so if you would, Bryce, give us a little bit more of your final remarks or one of your takeaways. And I would also like to ask is how can we find more about Pixel Health and the tools that you guys provide?
Absolutely. Well, first, I want to thank everybody for their really thoughtful remarks. It is a public health crisis, and the U.S. government recognized it as such. At the beginning of this year, the U.S. Surgeon General came out and said social media is responsible for a lot of our mental health issues in the country. And conversations like these are the way that we escape that and the way that we move beyond that. I think the first steps have been incredible in that getting phones out of the classroom, helping kids focus. I think we really come in when it comes to that other 16 hours that kids have their phones and helping kids think about how to use them appropriately in those 16 hours. And I think, just like with any other public health crisis in the past, it takes everybody. It takes all the stakeholders to come in and do what they can. And for us, we want to give you a way similar to what Dr. Debose said, to first measure and understand where you are as a community, and then to honestly take a few simple things can make a huge difference. So we develop resources and anyone can reach out. It's bryce@pixelhealth.io. We'll give you the tools to assess your community and also the tools to actually change your levels very quickly. Because when kids start to talk about this again, I want to reiterate, kids really don't like to be used. And at the end of the day, if we can show kids kind of their position in what these companies are doing and their position and, as future citizens of the world, as Dr. Brown said, kids are moved by that. And we should give kids credit that they actually do want to learn these things, and being able to do this can make a big impact. So thanks everyone for being part of this.
Are there any final questions?